Good day, everyone. My name is Zainab Usman. Thank you for joining us. I am the director of the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We are having this important event today on the unemployment crisis in Nigeria and South Africa, the African continent's two largest economies. At the Carnegie Africa program, we focus on the economic, the political, and the transnational issues that are shaping Africa today and that are of relevance to the continent's future. So the subject of employment, unemployment, and jobs is certainly important to what we focus on at the Carnegie Endowment. I have here with me a rather distinguished panel of individuals to discuss and talk about this topic. The first person is Ms. Trudy Makaya, economic advisor to President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa. She advises the president on economic policy, and she also serves as South Africa's G20 Sherpa. Previously, Trudy was a member of the executive committee at the Competition Commission of South Africa. She has held various management consulting and corporate roles at Deloitte South Africa, Genesis Analytics, and AngloGold Ashanti, and also non-executive directorships at Vumelana Advisory Fund and MTN South Africa. We also have Dr. Adeyemi Dipiolu, Special Advisor to the President on Economic Matters in the Office of the Vice President of Nigeria. He was director of the Capacity Development Commission of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa till December 2015. We also have Professor Harun Borat, the Professor of Economics and Director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. His research interests cover labor economics, poverty and income distribution. He has co-authored and co-edited more than 200 academic journal articles, book chapters, and working papers on labor markets and poverty issues in Africa. In September 2019, he was nominated to sit on the Presidential Economic Advisory Council, established by President Ramaphosa to generate ideas on growth, jobs creation, and poverty reduction. Then finally, we have Dr. Mark Sandberg, Chief Economist and Deputy Vice President at the Millennium Challenge Corporation in the United States. He is responsible for the quality of the Millennium Challenge Corporation's economic work and manages the division responsible for analysis of growth, poverty impact, and project cost-benefit analysis. Prior to joining the MCC, he had a distinguished career at the World Bank, holding several positions, including as manager of the economic management and country evaluation work of the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank. So clearly, these are highly regarded experts, and I can think of no better, panel of people to really tackle this topic. So how are we structuring this event? We're going to have a discussion of around, I would say, 50 minutes. Then we'll devote the last 10 minutes for a live Q&A session where the audience can actually ask questions. And all you have to do is to use the live chat feature in YouTube that you can see at the right side of your screens. Now, I'm going to start with Professor Harun Borat to frame the unemployment crisis in Nigeria and in South Africa. We're going to do this within around 10 minutes. But before we do that, let me try to explain why we decided to focus on this topic. In both Nigeria and South Africa, according to recently published labor force data, and of course, these are Africa's two largest economies, unemployment rates are alarmingly high. In Nigeria, total unemployment for the fourth quarter of 2020 stood at 33.3%, which is a third of the labor force. And for South Africa, it was similar, 32.5%. The numbers for youth unemployment are actually even much higher, at 42.5% for Nigeria and 46% for South Africa. I mean, some would even say that these figures are conservative estimates at best, especially in the case of Nigeria, where informality is high. Many people tend to be engaged in low wage and underpaid work. Therefore, underemployment, work in which people work for much less than 40 hours a week, is a huge factor. So all combined with underemployment, the figure in Nigeria rises to actually 56%. Now, both countries are large economies. They are anchors of their respective subregions. For South Africa, as we know, it is a hub for migrants from other parts of the continent, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and other countries. Then for Nigeria, it is a heavyweight in its own subregion, West Africa. And not surprisingly, these countries have experienced bouts of protests, including from young people. Since at least 2015 in South Africa, university students have been protesting against the cost of tertiary education under the Fees Must Fall movement. And in Nigeria, young people mostly protested police brutality under the banner of the EndSARS movement in October 2020. Now, I'm not at all trying to reduce complex, multifaceted drivers of protests and even in some cases uprisings to just economic factors. But we cannot deny that the large number of unemployed people in any country should be a cause for concern for any policymaker. In fact, as we know, unemployment was one of the proximate catalysts of the Arab Spring in 2011 in North Africa, Tunisia to begin with, and then Egypt eventually. Across the African continent, the question then of how to provide productive jobs for all is a salient one. Around 11 million people are estimated to join the labor force each year across the continent. And this is a very young continent, we have to remember, with a median age of just around 20 years. It is no surprise then that in the decent jobs generally has emerged as one of the top priorities for most African countries. So in an Afrobarometer survey across 34 countries, the most important problem identified by 40% of respondents was unemployment. Now, certainly this discussion is timely, one would say. So what are we hoping to achieve today? I think a key objective is for us to brainstorm on a way forward by identifying common trends, by sharing lessons and experiences, including from other countries, and then by identifying areas where development partners like the US can help. Now I'll hand over to Haroon. Haroon, can you help provide some reflections for us from your work on South Africa and the rest of the African continent?
Great. Thanks very much, Zainab. I'm glad to be involved in this webinar. It's a really, I think, topical issue. Perhaps what I'll try and do, Zainab, is just to give you an initial and give listeners and viewers a sort of quick overview, if you like, of the stylized facts with respect to unemployment in South Africa, much of which is actually known, but I'll try and tease out what I think are the more interesting and worrying trends that we've observed and how that then links to possible growth levers or policy levers for reducing unemployment. So the headline numbers are very well known. I mean, we currently, in terms of the fourth quarter of 2019, have a national unemployment rate of 29% by the ILO definition. Just to put that in perspective, the emerging market average, the middle income average, is about 12%. So South Africa towers above other middle income countries, certainly in terms of its unemployment rates. And I'll come back to one of the other statistics that actually reveals why this is so high. If you dig within that 29% number, and you start looking at, let's call it sort of demographic breakdowns, it's very clear that in the sort of apartheid classifications that we still use racially so that we can target disadvantaged groups, the unemployment rate for African individuals is 32%. For women, it's 31%. So both of those are above the national average. But here's the real trigger, if you like, for where our concern must lie, is that the unemployment rate for young people between the ages of 15 to 24 is 58%. So that means that close to 6 out of 10 young people that are entering the labor market in search of jobs in South Africa cannot find a job. What lies possibly behind that? Well, as we know, human capital matters, right? Human capital matters as the sort of key signal for getting employment. We find that the unemployment rate for those who've not finished secondary schooling is 37%, and it's 30% for those who've actually got a high school diploma. That's a really important signal. It suggests that even though you are accumulating some form of human capital, say in the secondary schooling system, even if you get that high school certificate, what we call in South Africa the matric pass, 30 or 3 out of 10 of those matriculants or 3 out of 10 of those high school diploma graduates will not find a job in South Africa. So that's an inordinately high number. And I just want to come back to a link to unemployment, that we often forget that one of the inequality, one of the drivers of inequality in the society is not just the differential between wage earners. It's the differential between the zero earners, those who don't have a job, and those who have a job. So often, if you like, I call it the labor market analog of South Africa being the most unequal society in the world, is that we have the highest unemployment rate in the world. If I just sort of quickly draw it back to sub-Saharan Africa, it's interesting, Zainab, that the sub-Saharan African unemployment rate, or the African unemployment rate, is very low actually by international comparisons. On a regional basis, the second lowest, it's about 6.7%. So it's fairly modest. I would argue, though, and this is perhaps useful for future discussion or ongoing debate, that if you look at demographic projections, 38% of all working age individuals by 2100 on the planet will be African, 38%. That's not a demographic challenge, that's a jobs challenge. So in many ways, I see that 6.7% ticking up, particularly in fast urbanizing populations like in economies such as Nigeria, where the structure of growth, the pattern of growth, and we can talk about that later, is insufficiently geared towards a labor-intensive path that's going to create large numbers of jobs for individuals streaming into the labor market. A final statistic, Zainab, and I'll take comments or allow colleagues to come in, is that I mentioned the corollary of South Africa's high unemployment rate is important, is that not only do we have the highest unemployment rate in a middle-income country sample, but we also have one of the lowest informality rates in that same sample. So effectively what South Africa has is an inability, so about 25% of the employed are in the informal sector, much lower than the rest of the developing world. So in effect, not only are we unable to create formal sector jobs, we are also preventing, and we can talk about why, young people principally from getting into these low barriers to entry jobs in the informal sector. And we're quite aggressive as a society, as policymakers, in actually preventing the entry of these individuals into these, let's call them low barrier to entry type jobs. But let me stop there. There are lots of other issues, and I welcome any comments.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that, framing discussion in terms of giving us a lot more statistics on the situation in South Africa, but also linking it to the rest of the continent. And I particularly liked the point you made about, for the African continent, how this relates to the demographics of, many countries. And that at the root of this is also how to create productive jobs for all these young people. And another important point that you made, I think, is, trying to, again, link this to the pattern of growth that we've seen in the past couple of years. That growth in many of these countries is happening in sectors that are not very labor intensive, that don't absorb a lot of labor. And then finally, for South Africa, that, it's a country with a small informal sector compared to the rest of the continent, meaning that, unfortunately, unlike even a country like Nigeria, where young people can at least do something that is, it probably might not pay very well, They might not have regular jobs, but they are somewhat engaged in some kind of economic activity. We don't necessarily see that in South Africa. So I'm going to come back to that. Now, I think we're going to go to colleagues from other countries, Trudy and also Yemi, to hear from them on, what socioeconomic initiatives these countries have tried to pursue to address unemployment, because I know they're not just sitting on their hands doing nothing, they're trying to do something, and how effective these socioeconomic initiatives have been or have not been in addressing this challenge. So Trudy, do you want to come in? I think you're muted. Okay, we can hear you now.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that. So I'll briefly talk to the South African case. I mean, I think Haroon has also touched on some of what drives unemployment. There is a bit of divergence in terms of understanding of the crisis. I think often when we engage with the business community, they often raise the rigidity in terms of labor market legislation and regulation. The challenge is often that the evidence is often not very clear as to the extent to which the regulatory framework is, or at least the labor regulatory framework is constraining unemployment. I think one interesting thing that's also often said is that if you look at the structure of our economy, there's an insufficient role played by the agriculture sector compared to many other many other African countries in particular. Then we also have spatial inequality and just the legacy of people living or having been forced to live very far from economic opportunities, and how that's also a driver of unemployment. And if you look at the core of the economy, it still remains quite skill and capital intensive, and in so doing, not creating enough jobs for those who come in, especially without experience and without much human capital in terms of education. Now, in terms of the current economic strategy, of course, a lot of it would be influenced by a response to COVID-19, the pandemic, the containment measures that came with that. We started with a massive public employment program. I'm just going to focus on the initiatives that directly target unemployment. So as part of the recovery plan, there was a push for governments to create short-term opportunities. For instance, teachers, assistants in schools, people working on conservation, working on cleaning up our communities, supporting the health efforts to deal with the pandemic as community health workers. Many of those kinds of opportunities, which are short-term in nature, driven by the state. We've always had expanded public works programs, but there was a massive scale up of these kinds of initiatives to get to 500,000 opportunities in a very short space of time. And the idea there was simply that, the private sector recovery would not be rapid enough to compensate for the jobs that have been lost during the pandemic. So that has been a success in delivering those opportunities. It is short term. There will be a second phase to it, but it has to be seen for what it is. It's a remedial measure to deal with a crisis. But if one takes a longer term view in terms of job creation, our economic recovery plan has different pillars to it. One of those pillars is infrastructure development, like many other plans across the world. We have maintenance issues that have accumulated over time. But also as a feature of being a middle-income country, we also have lots of areas where we need new infrastructure to be built. And so the infrastructure pillar of the plan hopes to stimulate the economy, but drawing in resources also from private sector in terms of financing some of this infrastructure. So we are going, to our earlier discussion, a blended financing type model where, government puts in a some money, significant money, but we're hoping that most of the money that we need, close to R1 trillion, will mostly come from the private sector. But we've also embedded within the infrastructure program projects that are going to be labor intensive. So there's a deliberate focus on road maintenance and road building in rural communities. There's a focus on maintenance in inner city buildings, also to support small scale entrepreneurs to undertake some of the work. So we're hoping that that infrastructure pillar will generate jobs in of itself in terms of the targeted initiatives, but of course would also stimulate the economy more broadly to get us to higher economic growth rates. I see the Reserve Bank today just issued a higher projection for our economic growth this year, because we're also seeing other positive factors that are supporting a stronger than expected recovery. Tourism is another pillar of our recovery plan. We know that this is clearly going to be in the medium term. At the moment, we're relying on domestic tourism, but also ensuring that we don't lose the capacity that we have within that sector, because it is one that can help poor communities and that is also labor intensive. Now, to the point I mentioned earlier around a very low proportion of agriculture in our economy, the recovery plan also has a food security and an agro-processing element to it. And linked to that is effective support for land reform recipients. You know, those who follow South African policy developments would know that land reform is an important thrust in our toolkit to deal with the legacy of the past. But we often find that beneficiaries of land reform, particularly those who, we're talking about those who reclaim the land that has been restored to them, or that benefit from redistribution of land towards communities, need support to make that land productive. And through that, we can support a more diverse agro-processing industry that also includes smaller scale production. So that's an important part of the recovery plan. We've had programs that have been rolled out that support that. And we're already seeing it in our export performance on, you know, that our agricultural sector is very sound. I think the challenge here is just to make sure that it addresses the needs of smaller scale and labor intensive parts of that industry. And then I will touch on other elements that I think are later, because I think that's when they will be more relevant. But a bigger part, of course, of job creation in our context is also around supporting small and medium enterprises. You know, we mentioned the challenge of not having a lot of informal activity. Some of that is structural, just in terms of an economy that is dominated by large enterprises, often with high barriers to entry in various sectors. But we have put into place initiatives that try to fund and provide access to markets for what we call broadly the rural and the township economy. And the idea is that we're not only creating kind of islands there, but linking that economy through digital technology, through access to markets to the rest of the economy. So you'd find initiatives like encouraging, for instance, the insurance industry to accredit small panel beaters and repair shops in townships, whereas, you know, under business as usual, they would only deal with bigger, you know, chain kind of panel beaters. So that kind of work, encouraging supermarkets, formal supermarkets, to dedicate some shelf space to products that are manufactured by small enterprises. Well, perhaps that's more for middle enterprises, because it does require a bit of sophistication. But we're trying to open up those kinds of opportunities so that the small and the medium end of the economy can grow and act as an effective creator of jobs. So I think I'll also stop there, and we can take questions and discussion later. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Trudy, for telling us about the plans that the South African government has in the short term, in the medium term, and also in the long term. Also focusing on, you know, infrastructure, public works, but also trying to kind of stimulate activity in the agriculture sector, and also trying to empower and help small and medium scale enterprises. Now let's hand over to Yemi from Nigeria for us to hear about what Nigeria is doing or is trying to do on this issue. I think you're muted, Yemi. Great.
Thank you very much, Trudy, and good afternoon, everybody else. I think I'll start with a quick profile of unemployment in Nigeria. As you mentioned, it's undeniably high at about 33%. Although I think for the purposes of international comparison, it is about 17.5%. Our National Bureau of Statistics uses the 40-hour per week metric, as opposed to the 1 hour a week favored by the ILO. And as you also pointed out, youth unemployment 15 to 34 years is also quite high. We have, it's at about 42.5%. There is a slight gender dimension to unemployment in Nigeria, but very slight. Female unemployment is at about 35%, while male unemployment is at about 32%. Perhaps striking is the fact that the unemployment is almost uniformly high across the whole country, except in a small cluster of states in the Southwest. It's also high across all educational categories, except those with doctorate degrees. Now, some of the points have been made about the courses. I think we share some of the courses together. Some of the factors in our case are certainly cyclical and some are structural. For instance, when growth was averaging over 5% from 2012 to 2014, unemployment was 6.4%. But we've had two recessions in the past 4 years. So just before the pandemic, unemployment had risen to 27% before it rose to the current 33%. Then, of course, there is the low employment elasticity of growth. So for every 1% of growth, a study has shown that we are creating only 0.11% jobs and growth in jobs. And that, of course, is mainly due to the fact that oil and gas, which are very capital intensive, play a huge role in economic activity and growth, as well as low value services, what you've referred to as the informal sector. But they also additionally, and the point has been touched, I think, earlier by Harun, was that you see, the pace of job creation is slower than the growth of the labor force. So the whole issue of the population growth rate, I think, matters a lot. In our case, 19 million people entered the workforce between 2016 and 2019, and only 3.5 million jobs were created at that time. So that sort of shows the scale of the challenge. Of course, the huge skills gap is another problem. So what we have are, first of all, an inadequate number of people having the skills to work in high growth sectors, but also where you have people who are qualified, there's a disconnect between their qualifications and the needs of the industrial and high growth sectors. And of course, there is, as I said, we had two recessions in the past. So there's the whole effect of hysteresis and scarring because of permanent output losses. For instance, a survey by our Bureau of Statistics showed that after the recession of 2016, over 2,900 businesses closed shop. Now, what are some of the policies we are trying to use? And I think I'll sort of classify them in three ways. The first is to mitigate the effect of the recessions. The second, of course, is to change the structure of the economy more medium term. And of course, direct job creation programs. So both our economic recovery and growth plan adopted in 2017 and the economic sustainability plan adopted last year had immediate objectives, of course, of restoring growth and to keep the recession short. And I think we achieved those objectives. So last year, after a recession, after two quarters of negative growth, fourth quarter of last year, marginally, but we had a positive growth of 0.11%. Now, the economic sustainability plan adopted in response to COVID is central to what we are trying to do now. The whole idea being to create jobs, to protect jobs, but to also provide payroll support. For instance, we were able to provide payroll support for over 500,000 people in our small and medium enterprises, and another 300,000 to people in the road transport workers and other artisanal groups. Key to that also programs to create jobs in agriculture, solar power, housing, and such like. The solar power program, for instance, taking advantage of issues of sustainability as well. We hope to create 250,000 jobs by connecting 500 million households, health centers, and schools to solar power. And that program is well underway. On the structural side, the emphasis is on agric. We have an Agric for Food and Jobs program, which is working with the private sector to support farmers using the existing ecosystem, so that we then have farmers being supported by off-takers who help them, some form of contract farming, if you will. And we've already registered 5 million farmers using geo positioning systems. And we are now trying to get finance to all of them to enable that system to go. But critical to that is the guaranteed offtake. Whatever you produce will be taken up by the aggregators, or finally, indeed, by manufacturing or by the government. In manufacturing as well, we are looking at our industrial plan in the light of COVID, but also in the light of the African Continental Free Trade Area, so that we can reposition manufacturing to take advantage of that last scheme, while also focusing our special economic zones on textiles and petrochemicals. I think, finally, I will talk about the digital economy. We think it's a great opportunity. The last Africa Pulse document of the World Bank indeed said that digital economy, even in the informal sector, was employing 1.6 times more people than the ordinary other people who did not use technology, and that they pay 2 times the wages. So we paid a lot of emphasis on that. We're creating a huge fund, well, by our standards, a $500 million fund, working with the African Development Bank as our national innovation program, and to be able to support private equity, venture capital, accelerators, and the like. And we're also using technology in that agric sector I mentioned. We're establishing a digital agricultural platform, which will help to bring all the farmers, the aggregators, and all the participants in the value chain together. We're doing a lot of infrastructure, but the focus, power, roads, as well as rail, but also infrastructure around broadband. We're aiming for 120,000 kilometers of broadband by 2025, and we are already past the halfway mark towards that. Then finally, the public works programs employing young people, 500,000 Empower for 2 years, young graduates, agriculture, teaching, and public health. And we are thinking of expanding that to 1 million this year. We have a special public works program, 774,000 young people, 1,000 per local government. And we're introducing next week a Jubilee Fellows program to 20,000 young people who would be given direct work experience to help address the mismatch. I end by talking about the challenges, of course, the challenges of state capacity, the challenges, of course, of inadequate vaccinations to help us open up the rest of the economy. And I mentioned the scarring earlier. And of course, very importantly, the inadequate growth in the global economy. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yemi. That was that was very detailed, very rich. Good to hear from you. Something very important that I thought you mentioned about that mismatch between the skills of people joining the labor force each year and what industry actually needs. And I think that is a point also Harun may have alluded to. And also in terms of the initiatives being pursued by the Nigerian government, either in the economic recovery and growth plan in terms of some of the more cyclical, counter-cyclical initiatives around restoring growth, payroll support also, as well as the small structural initiatives around supporting farmers and what you mentioned about guaranteeing offtake of produce from these farmers is something also I think Trudy mentioned that the South African government is trying to do. I would like to hear from Harun, if he has any remarks from what he has heard from, the representatives of Nigeria and South Africa in terms of the initiatives they're pursuing. What else needs to be done? I think for me, I'm quite worried about the mismatch that I see between the skills of people in the labor market, between education systems very, very important, and the needs of a, growing, evolving, and changing economy in both cases. So I just wondered if maybe in 2 or 3 minutes you can quickly give any additional remarks on this.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Zainab, I mean, both Trudy and the colleague from Nigeria did talk a little bit about growth rates, right? So if I maybe make two sets of comments, one is about the demand side for labor, and that's very much in this context about not just the level of growth, but the nature of economic growth. And so again, in the South African context, you cannot be growing at 1%, if you go back to 1990, but even in the post-94 period, growing at 2% per annum for 20 odd years. So you have a levels problem. So one of the closest thing you have to a magic bullet in terms of upgrading the quantum of jobs created is to make sure you get higher levels of growth, right? But that's a necessary but not sufficient condition. And I think both colleagues alluded to the importance of thinking about, very eloquently, about sectoral strategies. So if you listen to the sort of practical expertise at the policy coalface, they essentially are talking about how can we rewire the nature of our growth recovery so that we're either focusing on agriculture or manufacturing and so on. The literature, at least based on East Asia, would suggest that somewhere, somehow, low-wage manufacturing has to feature, right? That there has to be, and one can think of what, where services ends and where manufacturing begins. But in essence, there's some very clear, or there's a very clear evidence, at least from East Asia, that you need a large-scale, low-wage manufacturing, let's call it even processed agriculture sector, that's going to be the engine of urban wage jobs. I think without that, you're going to find it very difficult, even if you're clicking along at 5-6%, when the oil price is high in Nigeria or the copper price is really high in Zambia. That's what's going to give you those 5-6% growth rates. But that's cyclical, right? So unless you get that structural transformation at the moment, in my view, which is either about low-wage manufacturing or let's call it medium-skilled services. In South Africa, as Trudy knows, call centers are business process outsourcing is really important. Those kinds of sectors will generate or have a better chance of generating the kinds of jobs you need than a pure sort of primary commodity type structural transformation. So that's the demand side for labor. It's critical. We don't see sufficient evidence across the continent of rapid structural transformation happening. There are a few pockets of progress. Ethiopia, Kenya are good examples. In South Africa's case, we have a very high base, but we've stalled in terms of the pattern of structural transformation, and therefore jobs are difficult. On the supply of labor side, you're exactly right, Zainab. I mean, there's a mismatch problem. So what you have, if I could just use the South African example, is you do have on paper, you do have, according to the Labour Force Survey, a sufficiently large number of secondary schooling graduates. But you have to take the second order question, which is what does the quality of that schooling look like? And based on standardized test scores for South Africa, we don't do very well. We do much worse than low-income countries, at least on average, right? In sub-Saharan Africa in some cases. And so you've got a low-quality schooling issue, which means that employers effectively inflate the requirements for a job where perhaps a high school diploma is required, end up hiring graduates. And so you get wage premiums and feeds into inequality, all sorts of problems. But essentially, you've got a mismatch issue. Whereas in a relatively efficiently functioning labor market, what you'd have is the match from a high school graduate to a high school job, if you like. That's not happening in South Africa because the quality of that schooling for the majority of South Africans is actually very poor. And so I suspect that's playing itself out, certainly in from the evidence I know for Ghana, and in Kenya it's playing itself out, and possibly in Nigeria. So for me, you can crystallize your demand side problem as a structural transformation issue, and the supply side, at least in one conception of it, a mismatch between the production of skills and schooling and the demand side. It's just a final point, and Trudy's exactly right. Location in South Africa matters a lot, right? we've got far too much of a disconnect spatially between where the jobs are and where individuals live. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. So now I'm gonna call in Mark Sundberg from the MCC. For Mark, we would like to hear what role external partners like the US can play in helping to address the situation we find in countries like, of course, Nigeria and South Africa, but also other parts of the continent. What role can the United States play more broadly also in Africa's post-pandemic recovery? Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Zainab, and thanks for inviting me to this this panel. It's extremely important issues that we're discussing, but I do need to start with a caveat that while MCC is active in 16 countries in the African continent, we are not active in either Nigeria or South Africa, either due to income thresholds that we apply to our selectivity framework or because of governance factors and control of corruption concerns. But having said that, I'd like to make 3 points that may seem relatively obvious about development partners and how they can be most effective in contributing to the growth and unemployment objectives of governments, and circling around issues of a need to focus on growth, on inclusion, because what I would characterize as quality of growth, and also on the quality of foreign assistance is being provided. So let me start with the issue of growth. Employment, of course, is a derived demand. So foreign assistance should really focus on the addressing in a focused way the binding constraints to growth. And we started MCC with an analysis to look at what are those binding constraints to growth. Foreign assistance will be small relative to total need in any country that we go into. So donors need to recognize that they need to, I think, focus their assistance in ways that will really move the needle in generating growth. The analysis that we begin with is looking at what are the critical factors that are preventing investment from occurring, or constraining cost competitiveness in the economy, or around risk tolerance that investors face. And having identified that, we use a methodology, pardon me, that was developed at Harvard, the Hausman-Roderick-Velasco approach. But that's really heuristic. You need to think more deeply about what are the factors that are really preventing those sorts of investment that other speakers have discussed here from taking place that will generate employment. And having identified those key binding constraints that we would prioritize, the question then becomes, what are the root causes for that? What is the source of market failure, of inadequate supply of key inputs? What are the institutional factors and weaknesses that may prevent investment from occurring in the formal sector in particular, but more broadly across the economy? And what are the constraints due to inadequacy of public services, key infrastructure, access to cost-efficient electricity, which is so key to small and medium enterprises, but of course to industry, as Harun was saying, the importance of generating investment in labor-intensive and low-skilled industries. So we use that as an entry point for trying to prioritize, and I think foreign investors, development partners in general need to do this, and do this jointly with local government, local counterparts, be they in civil society, private sector. You need to have a comprehensive view of what the problems are to focus those interventions and to get at the root causes. The second point I mentioned was on inclusion. Growth in and of itself, I don't think is adequate. It really calls for inclusive growth, or what I would call quality of growth, both inclusion and sustainability, as being particularly critical to the unemployment agenda. So, how can foreign aid serve to generate jobs? What are the sources of incremental growth, and what's the distribution impact of that growth? Poor income distribution, I think we've, at least I'm convinced by recent research and work, including at the IMF, poor distribution is a constraint to shared growth and to addressing job creation, and needs to be brought to the fore. We approach this through adjusting the growth diagnostics to look at engendering growth, not just around gender, but around excluded communities, and to think about how constraints to participation are compromising outcome. We're also partnering with Tulane University to look at incidence analysis, fiscal incidence analysis, and taking in particular how we may draw on that incidence analysis to affect the design of infrastructure investments, which is the main area where MCC is investing, but also to think about at the subnational level where we may be more selective, given that we're relatively small in the overall aid dialogue, but where at the subnational level we can have a greater impact. And that in Indonesia, for example, where we're operating or preparing to operate at the subnational level in 3 provinces. We're also trying to bring to bear job diagnostics that are not looking at sort of active labor market policies that were in vogue, say, 10 years, 12 years ago, but to really focus on the demand side. And that, for example, in TVET programs that we're supporting in Morocco, Cote d'Ivoire, these are trying to partner with the private sector to identify what are the skills and appropriate level of education preparation, including soft skills, that will fit the labor market needs and hence be more successful than past TVET programs that have been more supply oriented. We also are increasingly conducting a high growth potential industrial analysis to try to identify what are the proximate technologies and areas where MCC's investments could have the greatest impact in the private sector. This has been done recently in Indonesia and in Ethiopia, where we're active. So the last thing to mention, and perhaps it is the most obvious one, is the need for development partners to provide good quality assistance. So what does that mean? That is having focused investments rather than highly fragmented, and working with the public or in some instances public-private service provision. Pure grant resources, which MCC provides, means you're not focused on debt repayment and debt collection. Alignment, most critically, I think, alignment with government priorities and a deep sense of that ownership around the analytics and the evidence that provides that scope around the focus on binding constraints and the root causes. That means also focusing on local implementation teams, which MCC is known for, and on broad consultation with government, private sector, civil society in developing and designing programs. These principles sound like, I'm sure sound familiar from the 2005 Paris Declaration. That agenda, I think, is still work in progress. And there are areas where it's quite incomplete. Aid remains highly fragmented. There are the number of agencies engaged in the aid sphere is actually increasing. The compliance burden is still very heavy on many countries, and the use of country systems is quite limited. So I'll stop there and welcome questions, but there are many other issues to move into: a blended finance on natural wealth, the importance of climate change figuring into the medium-term growth agenda, and technical transfer priorities for donors as well. But thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was very useful for us to understand better how the MCC works, and knowing that it operates in, you said, I think, 16 countries across the African continent, although it does not have programs in South Africa and in Nigeria due to income thresholds, but also you mentioned governance challenges. One question for me is, going forward, even if it's not in the near future, but sometime in the future, would MCC consider large countries like, Nigeria, but also South Africa, that also have, even if on paper and in practice, they are fairly wealthy countries, middle income countries, they have significant spatial inequalities, as Trudy rightly mentioned. this is also a challenge in Nigeria, actually, that when you move beyond certain prosperous regions or states, you have like second tier regions or cities or even towns where, there's a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployment and underemployment, and a lot more economic challenges than national averages would have you believe. So the question is this something that going forward MCC would consider, given that you mentioned the agency is also kind of reconfiguring its growth diagnostics. So that's one question that I have. But I think I'll also hand over to Trudy and to Yemi to quickly give any remarks or responses they might have to Mark. If you could please make that in less than 2 minutes so we can address the questions that have come in from our audiences. And we have many questions, by the way. So, Trudy or Yemi, very quickly, if you have any responses to what Marcus said.
All right. If we keep the order, I'll go first.
Yeah.
So I think on the role of external partners, there were two issues I held off earlier. I think on the green economy, which is also an important part of our recovery strategy, but it requires a lot of support in meeting some of the upfront costs of that transition. We're a very coal-dependent, energy-intensive economy. And so for us to actually have any green economy aspirations, one has to, have a clear path for what you do with people and the jobs that are in the carbon-heavy economy, so to speak. And I think this is where, climate finance can come into the picture. We're seeing a market develop and demand really develop for projects in African countries and developing countries that are about the just transition and, that are about renewable energy, green hydrogen, so many opportunities, the biodiversity economy, but it does need external support. It's not something that a country could easily do just with internal resources. Then the second part, I think, supporting the work of regional integration. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is in force as we speak. We're about to enter into the second phase of negotiations. But, for this agenda to make sense, and I think this is going to be a great source of job creation, but we've got to eliminate a lot of the non-tariff barriers that prevent trade. So some of it has even to do with infrastructure that connects the continent. Some of it has to do with regulations and just generating efficiencies in economies. And then I think finance for cross-border trade is also important because, I've seen a lot of work that says, yes, we often lament the low level of intra-African trade. But if you think about cross-border trade, which is, some of it is informal, it's actually significant in many parts of Africa. And even with, in Southern Africa, if you look at the corridors, some of the food corridors, light manufacturing corridors, are quite advanced, but are still informal and nascent and require a lot of support. So I think that work of regional integration is also one that would benefit from international support. Thank you.
Yemi, any quick responses?
Yes, just to say that I really like the way Marcus framed the issues and emphasizing growth, a good competitive business environment, having social protection programs, developing vocational skills. I think I like all that. I just wanted to say two things. One is you didn't mention the short term. I think the greatest help we need now is support for vaccinations. Without resources, we're not going to be able to vaccinate the vast majority of the population. And you're not going to be able to open up all sectors of the economy. So a lot of economic growth is going to be held back by the fact that you don't have enough resources to have mass vaccination. And the second one I would say is I would personally like to see a lot of support from the partners in terms of, and he didn't allude to it, but in terms of support for building infrastructure so that we don't all have to look in one direction for support to build infrastructure, but also to promote investment in high growth sectors like the manufacturing sector and the digital economy. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Mark, did you want to just quickly comment before we move to the Q&A session?
These are excellent questions and very much live in MCC. MCC is a relatively young organization. It was founded in 2004, and we're now going through an exercise of really rethinking how changes since then need us to refocus on our development strategy. And the question you asked, Zainab, about work in middle-income countries where there are often lagging regions and extreme poverty, although that's not reflected by national averages, is very much a live question we're facing as we think about effectiveness of the agency in addressing growth and poverty reduction. Challenge with lagging regions is the effectiveness of foreign assistance in supporting growth and poverty reduction. Should you be looking at a strategy that really needs to recognize those constraints and move people out, or a strategy that's an enabling environment to move capital in, and thinking through that and identifying appropriate strategies and whether it would fit within the MCC model is something that's an active debate. The question, the point that Trudy is making about the green economy and upfront costs of greening, you're absolutely right. And if you look at the financing needs of addressing climate change on the mitigation side or on adaptation side, they're far greater than global foreign aid, foreign assistance. So I think this brings to the fore the critical need for blended finance and for finding ways in which you can efficiently use scarce public resources through concessional assistance or grants to leverage private sector investment into those critical areas that will shift off of coal dependence in electrical generation, for example. And that's a big agenda. It's one that, frankly, I don't think we're doing a terribly good job of yet. I also think, Trudy, that your point about regional integration is fundamental. I should mention MCC has just recently, a couple of years ago, been given authorization by Congress to develop regional compacts between MCC countries. We need to think about that impact, not just between the two countries, but more broadly, regional integration. Right now, we have programs under preparation design in West Africa with their 5 adjoining countries, from Cote d'Ivoire to Togo, Benin, Ghana, Burkina Faso, etc., where working with the West African Power Pool is an opportunity to look at integration and greater efficiency. But that's a key issue going forward. I should probably stop there, but I appreciated Yemi's insights as well and questions.
Excellent, thank you. So now we're going to the questions and answers session. We are running out of time. We have only 2 minutes to go, but I hope some of our panelists could be able to stay for another 5 minutes, just so we can get through some of the questions we have received. And I'm very happy that this is turning out to be very, very interactive. We've received a lot of comments and questions, so I'll try to summarize and bunch some of them together. The first one we have received so far is from, well, it's not the first one, but one of the first we're picking is from Preston Llewellyn. How much of a difference will the Africa Continental Free Trade Area make to economic prospects, including high unemployment rates? So I'll also combine that with another question on how, just a second, I think okay. So I'll combine that with another question, with 2 or 3 questions on the post-COVID recovery. So one is on how can these countries leverage green transition and environmental sustainability to generate jobs? This is a question from Bemisola Akinola. Then relatedly, what should African countries look to do to drive economic activities in the manufacturing sector? And the final one is, how does Professor Borat suggest the government address the high degree of informality in South Africa that partly explains the high unemployment rate? And how can the state improve on small-scale entrepreneurship in sub-Saharan Africa? So a question on the AFCFTA, on informality in South Africa and how it can be leveraged, and a green transition and environmental sustainability to generate jobs. So maybe Harun can start.
Thanks, Zainab. So I'll obviously take the question directed to me about the informal sector. So again, just to reiterate, the point is that we have a very low share of the employed in any form of informal sector activity. In terms of a policy response, if you look at and one can talk about the reasons for it, but the South African sort of approach, almost by default, to the informal sector is one of exclusion. So keep the informal sector out of cities. Make sure that only those with formal licenses can enter in the city, and if they do come into the city, make sure that they don't sort of impinge on the operation of the larger formal sector operators. And that's, of course, very antithetical to how the informal sector works in the rest of the developing world. The example I often use is anywhere in South Asia, the distance between home and your firm is 1 meter, right? In South Africa, it's hundreds of kilometers often sometimes. And so there's a whole mindset change that's required in the policy regime at the local government level and provincial government. I think the national framework exists to think about that, and Trudy will attest to that. So it's more about local governments thinking about how can we provide an environment that's far more conducive to the growth of this informal sector. It's what we often call, when we speak to non-economists, as this notion of dirty development. So let people flow into cities, let informal sector activities burst out across streets in South African cities. We don't think of the informal sector in that way. So for me, that's the one big change that's required. And then just very quickly on the manufacturing question, I think Mark partly alluded to it. So I like to think of it as a complexity issue, right? That in many cases, if you're producing oil for Yemi in Nigeria, the nearest product to oil arguably could be something like petroleum jelly, right? Yet Nigeria still imports petroleum jelly. So the notion of building complexity in nearby products that you currently are involved in producing or maybe even exporting is about capabilities that you currently have and moving to those products nearby. Of course, that's the Hausman thesis about building complexity. I think it's a really valuable instrument at the country level to focus on what I call frontier products, those products that you do know that are close enough to the ones you're currently producing. The challenge then is to move to the capability constraints, to the constraints that you find operating at the product level in terms of actually preventing a country from exporting that product or moving into that manufacturing, or as the case may be, agro-processing type product. And analytical work for South Africa suggests that they're eminently doable, right? It's often things such as non-tariff barriers, getting veterinary surgeons out to farms in South Africa to ensure that the products that we are producing are fit and ready for EU markets, right? It's those types of state interventions that actually could open up markets quite rapidly for South Africa and I think many African economies. So I think thinking about this as a complexity challenge in the product space kind of framework is really valuable as one looks to sort of grow low-wage manufacturing.
So I thank you for that. I should have mentioned that some of the questions were asked by Habibullah Nu and Yvonne Mango. So actually, there's a question on AFCFTA on how, how much of a difference will it make or should it make in terms of addressing unemployment. So that's one. Actually, let me bunch it with a number of other questions also, as I see we're running out of time. A question asked by Kenneth Aibinode is there a nexus or correlation between unemployment and corruption in government? And then he's also asking, should the structure of formal education be revolutionized to emphasize practical and entrepreneurship programs? Should Africa leapfrog to the fourth industrial revolution as a policy, or just focus on being the factory of the world, replacing China? What is feasible? So a couple of questions there. Yemi, Trudy, Mark, anyone? Does anyone want to come in there? AFCFTA, entrepreneurship, corruption.
I'll try my hand.
Yeah.
I think on AFCFTA, I think clearly it would make a lot of difference. Of course, just from the trade creation aspect of bringing down trade barriers, the potential for having regional value chains whereby you can add value to products within the continent, and even the development of a continental payment system would all really help to promote growth in the continent coming from AFCFTA. And once we have that growth, surely some of the employment would follow. On the green transition and environmental sustainability, I'll just mention that we have this solar program I spoke about, which is basically based on trying to create about 250,000 jobs, moving people. While we have this energy constraint, you have a power constraint, to try and move people onto the grid, but by using renewable energy. And I'll leave it there, except to say that it shouldn't be a choice between the fourth industrial revolution or becoming the factory of the world, but it's something we should try to do at the same time, because I don't think they are mutually exclusive. Thank you.
Trudy?
All right, if I may come in there. So I also think that, the regional integration would support significant amount of jobs. But as I mentioned earlier, it's removing those barriers to integration that's going to be quite important. I mean, from South Africa, we already see, if we compare our export basket to the rest of the continent versus our export basket to the rest of the world, the more sophisticated one and the more diverse one is the one to the rest of the continent. So there really are a lot of arguments why you would see job creation coming from regional integration. I also agree with the point that Yemi made, that we need different strategies. So the digital economy is very important, and scaling people to participate in that is crucial. We've entered into a lot of partnerships, including with global giants like Amazon, IBM, Microsoft, when they invest in South Africa, to couple that investment with very jobs relevant training opportunities for young people. I think, of course, the challenge with all of this is always just about scale, just doing it at a level that makes a difference to the numbers. I think one area that would concern one around the issue of being the future factory of the world is that we're seeing employment intensity of manufacturing going down, in terms of the use of digital technologies, the use of 4IR technologies in manufacturing that are making it actually less job creating than it would have been 20 years ago when it drove development in other parts of the world. So I think we need to be mindful of that, and that should help us recognize that we actually need a multi-pronged strategy where manufacturing is absolutely important, but it has to be supplemented by other opportunities in services, agro-processing, etc. But thank you very much for that.
Okay, I'll hand over the final minute to Mark. Any response to any of the questions?
The last question about integrated trade area is, of course, critical. If you think about the subcontinent as being one market, the opportunities for scale economies would be enormous. But it's far from that ideal. And I'd like to draw attention to a different challenge, I think, and that is around the issue of urbanization and the ability to achieve agglomeration economies. I think I can't speak to Nigeria and South Africa in particular, but the challenge of agglomeration, I think this is something that Harun has worked on in the past, is it's quite different from what occurred in East Asia, where the levels of income, wage competitiveness and productivity growth are far more challenging in the subcontinent. I think that calls for greater attention to the role of cities and agglomeration economics in achieving scale economies going forward. So let me just throw that idea out there, and perhaps future Carnegie seminars will be able to tackle it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Mark. And I think it's a good point to conclude upon. So thank you very much to all of our panelists today, from Nigeria, Emi Dipolu, from South Africa, Trudy Makaya, Mark Sunderberg from the MCC here in the United States, and also Professor Harun Borat. And thank you to our audiences for such a lively engagement. There were so many comments and questions we really couldn't go through. So have a wonderful day. And this is just the beginning of a very important discussion and engagement for us at Carnegie Africa, and also for the countries involved. So have a nice day, everybody.
Thank you.
Sign up.